We are live. Hi, everybody out there on the internet and everybody here. Welcome to our weekly basic income discussion group. Today we're talking about prison and how that relates to basic income. So some of us read an article about our Norwegian prison island, Bastoy, south of Oslo, where the prisoners kind of live in this community environment. Obviously, they can't leave the island usually, and they're prisoners, but they get to live relatively normal lives. The idea is to have them live relatively normal lives. So I wanted to start by asking what we feel like is important for prison. Why is prison important to society, and what needs to be, like, how far are we from getting prison right, and what needs to happen in order to get prison right? Can you not?
Well, I wanted you to be able to see the comments if people came in.
Yeah, let's do the comments.
Can you isolate those?
Yes.
You don't want to watch yourself up there?
I don't want to watch myself. Hi, everybody. I don't want to watch myself. You can watch me out there in the world. Yeah.
Good stuff.
And then how do you make it smaller?
It looks like Mitchell is up there at least.
Mitchell is up there. There we go.
Hi, Mitchell.
Yeah. So I warned him that we were running a little bit late today.
Gotcha.
So yeah, we're talking about prison. What's wrong with prison? What do we as a society need out of the prison system? And how does basic income factor in? How does basic income, how does it affect prison? And how does it affect basic income? So I'm going to ask kind of those general questions, and I want to get people's initial thoughts about prison and basic income. So why don't we go clockwise this time?
Okay. That was a really provocative article about taking away only the freedom, which is a big thing, but everything else was normalized. And there are a few things. One is what we talked about with the racism topic, which was basic income that brought crime down because people didn't now need to mug people on the streets as much. So there's that part of basic income. But I also noticed that in that article, they give the prisoners some money so they can shop and so forth. They actually kind of have the equivalent of a basic income in that prison system, which, along with working, which is also kind of parallel with that, gives them a sense of normality. Yeah, and I mean, most prisons here are designed to punish in every way, not just taking away freedom, but also living conditions. So I'm not sure how basic income would ultimately affect, but I see it on kind of two sides. Before getting into prison, and then once in prison, it can be used to normalize a life, which obviously has reduced the recidivism in that situation.
Okay. Richard.
Well, the author of the piece, he spent time in prison, and he was talking about how there were prison riots and things like that, because like the psychiatrist or whatever said in the Oslo prison, Bastoy prison, that if you treat people like animals, they're going to act like animals. And they were talking about how there's like a 60% recidivism rate in the Wales, Scotland, and England prisons, because they're just treated poorly, and they're not prepared to go outside for life outside of the prison. So if you're giving them money while they're in prison, then they're going to have some resources to fall back on when they actually get out of it.
Elizabeth.
I think everything that we do with our prison system is messed up and wrong. And I think one thing that basic income could potentially alleviate, besides the sort of recidivism and other things that people talked about, is that sort of some of the things we learned about sort of normalcy that in our current prison system, like prison labor is paid like pennies on the hour, and prisoners are charged exorbitant rates for things like phone calls to their family or like super basic amenities the prisons don't provide them with. And so if there were a way for there to be a basic income that then doesn't get a carve out for like, oh, you forfeited if you go to prison, which I think is highly likely would happen, but like politically. But if you could have a way in which people retain their basic income while they're in prison, you potentially like even out that market somewhat. I mean, maybe you don't. Maybe they're just like, okay, cool, we're still charging you exorbitant rates, just now you can pay it better. But yeah. I would like us to just abolish the entire prison system.
Very, very low price elasticity of demand in prisoners. Yeah.
I hate everything about our prison system. I don't think that getting rid of people's freedom is a useful way to punish people. I think that we're just interested in punishing people and we treat prisoners like by virtue of having broken the law in scare quotes, like that they have forfeited their right to be treated like human beings.
Okay.
I have a lot of feelings about this, unsurprisingly.
Okay, unsurprising. Yeah, Nick.
Well, I guess similarly, I think that a lot of, maybe everything, or what about our prison system should be revisited and really changed a lot. I think, and I guess I haven't made a lot of connections between. To me, they seem like pretty separate issues, basic income and changing the prison system. I think my views about them are kind of influenced by the same impulse I have, that like more freedom for people is better, maybe. But yeah, I mean, I think that that people really assume that we need prisons. I would like to have that not taken for granted. I think that prisons as we know them now are a relatively recent invention, and I think we can come up with something much better.
Okay.
Brace yourselves, because I mean, I heard your opinions. It's not like I'm biased, but I disagree with some points. So, I mean, I hope we can have different opinions, of course. And I just wrote down a couple things that I heard so far that I kind of a little disagree with. 5 points actually.
What's your name again?
Zlatko.
Zlatko.
Yes,
Okay.
and he's Papa.
Papa.
Yeah. So 5 points. Number one, I heard, and I've also read a lot of articles that in other prisons in the world, for instance, in westernized countries such as Denmark, for instance, they do give prisoners money. But I don't think that is a good idea, giving prisoners money, especially not at first, because the prisoners might not spend the money well enough. But I'm just giving it as a short point, so that's point number one. Number two, I heard people here and also in general, people mention that prisons are designed to punish. Of course that's true, but isn't that the purpose of prisons? Maybe I'm wrong, but prisons are correctional facilities, right? In prisons, usually, criminals go to prisons, usually, right? If they're rightfully charged. So if a criminal goes to prison, the prison acts as a form of punishment. They should be punished in some way. Maybe restricting their freedom is not the perfect choice, but so far I don't think we've had a better alternative, and I think it is a good choice so far to punish people if they commit a crime, to punish them by putting them in prison. For instance, if someone kills a man, you should put him in prison. That's what I believe. That's number two. So most people who go to prison are rightfully there. Number three, I think in general in the past couple of decades, there has been problems with authority. In general, even me, teenagers especially, they don't respect authority, right? They don't like the police, they don't like the everything, but I think, especially in America, because I'm not American, but I do respect America's laws and regulations. So I think if we all maybe respected the laws and regulations a little more, it would be better. That's my opinion. For instance, like I've traveled all over the world, and everywhere I travel, I try to go legally, of course, with a visa. I try not to break the rules. So if someone breaks the rules, I think they should be somehow punished for that somehow. I don't know if prison is the perfect choice, as I said, but they should be somehow punished. Whether they come here, whether they break the law by coming here illegally, crossing the border, or by killing a person, or by stealing something, whatever the crime may be, I think they should be punished for the crime somehow. Um, and just to clarify, I think it's easy to get a visa. It just takes less than a week. You go to the embassy, get a visa. Number four. I think the prison in the United States, the prison system is broken, but in comparison to a lot of other countries where I've lived, including my country, Republic of Macedonia, and a lot of European countries, which maybe as Americans you think they're like perfect countries, but trust me, a lot of European countries are not as good as you might think. So number four is that even though the American system in the US is broken, I admit, I think that in comparison to a lot of other countries in the world, it is not as broken. So I think it is better than a lot of other countries. And number five is because we're both business students, I've actually researched about about the spending of the prison system in the U.S. and they do spend a lot of more money. And I actually have a couple of points of how they can reduce the spendings, because that's a really important part. They can reduce the spendings of the prison system and just not spend as much money. The government should try to spend that money on something else and not prisons.
Great.
Yeah.
Pablo.
So prison as a tool for deterring, crime. I think, yeah, if you make them too nice, like you get money. Now you also have, let's say, almost a similar level of freedom as a normal citizen who did not commit crime. I think, in theory, it should act as a less of a deterrent. But then again, as he mentioned, the United States is spending a lot of money on prison systems, and I'm not from here. I have to say the prison system here. India, we don't spend a lot of money on prison systems, so they just stack up people over there. Now they're running out of capacity and all, but they don't invest a lot of money in prisons and correction facility. United States, I'm not sure exactly how the government's view on these topics are, but yeah, I'm sure we can do a cost benefit. If you're spending so much on these outliers in society, I'm not sure how Nordic countries and other Western European nations are tackling this issue, but I think with the United States has of course, first of all, a bigger population, large number of prisoners, and I guess a higher rate of violent crime offenders as compared to Nordic countries. I've heard the murder rates in these countries are like pretty low as compared to the United States. So I think it's a tough ethical question, but we can view it from the frame points of a cost-benefit analysis. How much is it costing us, and how much is the benefit we're getting out of putting these people in a facility like this, and we're giving them more income, and how much benefit can the society derive out of that? So I think we should look at it from that perspective. But again, I'm very new to this topic of prison system in the United States. Over to you, right?
All right. So, I have a kind of an open mind because I don't have a lot of experience or knowledge about either side. I don't know what it's like to be in law enforcement. I don't know what it's like to be having friends and family go to prison. But I guess my gut reaction is, in terms of just the prison system in general, is that my personal bar for taking away a lot of someone's freedom, kind of let alone some of the other conditions, would be like very, very, very high. It doesn't quite seem like that matches at least the society's bar for, like we mentioned, kind of exploring other solutions or, in all sorts of ways. In terms of basic income, there's a few things that kind of come to mind. So one is on the prevention end, and I think maybe you mentioned this already, like I think people having more money would help prevent crimes. Yeah. So that's really good. And then also when it comes to deterrence, I think it would be rational to say, and I don't know if this is true in practice, that having a better quality of life would mean that it takes you less of a negative punishment to deter you because you have more to lose. This at least seems to be true with wealthier people, you know, it doesn't take like a lot to deter, and that might be mostly because they already don't have much incentive to commit the crime, but also like if you have a lot to lose, then maybe even going, like if you have a good quality of life, then going to an island with a decent quality of life, but you can't be with your friends and family is still like really bad. Whereas if you have a terrible quality of life anyway, maybe even the current prison system doesn't seem that bad. So, you know, giving people a higher baseline, I think means that you don't have to create such misery in terms of the deterrence. Giving people money also means you can use fines as more of a deterrence, which I think all else being equal, I have a lower bar for fines than like incarcerating someone. So if people already have money, you can do that. If nobody has any money anyway, and this is true now sometimes, I think that there can be like a fine or imprisonment as an option, and like if you don't have any money to pay the fine, you probably don't have that option. So I see that as another way to like have different options, is if people had a certain baseline you could fine people out of. Yeah. And I'm sure there's a lot of other preventative stuff that it would affect too. Yeah.
Well, this is great. I like that there's a wide variety of opinions here. I wanted to call attention to kind of like the two main things that we say we want to get out of prisons when we talk about the benefit of prisons. And one of them is the rehabilitation, so that the people who are in prison don't commit crimes again. And then another one is the punishment or the deterrence. What?
Nothing. No, nothing. Nothing to say.
Yeah. So I mean, like,
sorry.
The article we read was, you know, it was about an island where they were really working on rehabilitating people so they wouldn't go back and commit crimes again. But then there's this trade-off too, like if you want to show everyone that the punishment is so bad and they're expecting the punishment to be really bad, does that help prevent the initial offense more? Right. So I think these are kind of two goals, and they maybe can be made to be compatible with each other. But a lot of times, the more you're punishing, the less you're rehabilitating. Right. The less you're preparing people to, you know, reintegrate into society, that kind of thing. I
think that's a really good point.
Yeah, I don't think deterrent is. It's also been proven that knowing that you'll go to prison isn't necessarily deterrent for many crimes, like spur of the moment murder. That's not planned. It's a murder of passion. That's
right. So then there's also the benefit of keeping dangerous people out of society.
That's right.
So the kinds of people.
I agree with that. I agree that there needs to be a way to keep people to protect society. Very simple. I mean, even if it's not the best place, I don't know about the punishment part, but certainly the protection part.
Right. Well, not everyone who's in prison, and in fact, the vast majority of people who are in prison are not people who society really needs to be protected.
Exactly.
Right.
And there needs to be sorting. There's a lot of complications with that. Yeah. And there are a lot of innocent people. The Innocence Project has shown that too. That there are a good not a majority, but a good minority of people who now have shown that they don't belong there because of DNA results that weren't there in the beginning.
Sure. Yeah, there's certainly problems with wrongful convictions and things like that. I think that's not really what I want to focus on in this discussion. Yeah, go ahead, Richard.
Like there's, I think it was last year or something like that. There was a judge in Pennsylvania that was like bribed to send all these juvenile delinquents and things like that to this prison, and just sent them there even though they didn't need to go there, and that's
right. So is this because the private prison wanted to make money? So then there's the question of the incentives of the prisons, right? If they're for profit, then you know, they win when there are more prisoners.
Yes.
So then that creates an incentive to create more prisoners or to turn more people into prisoners.
Yeah.
And make sure that they're not prepared to go outside of society until they come back into
repeat customers. Yeah. Yeah. Go ahead.
Two things. Number one is a question because I'm not educated on this.
Sure.
I mean, I am on the topic, but specifically this question is how many prisons in the United States are for profit and how many are not for profit? Maybe I can research that. I just don't have Wi-Fi right now, but
I can try to
10% or something.
10% are for profit or not?
Yeah.
For profit.
It's a relatively small.
But even the ones that are not for profit, there's still like a prison industrial complex of the people who do like I forget what they're called, but like the super overpriced like phone call.
Oh, yeah.
The people who provide food.
Like, they still make money off
There's a
of
whole
it.
industry that's still making money off
Yeah,
of
I understand.
prisons.
And powerful unions, at least in some states, like California, the prisons guards unions are really what.
And number two, I wanted to agree with her point about raising the basic income, because after all, that's the topic of this, right? Basic income. So if people obviously had a higher basic income, crime would decrease. So that's really related to each other. I think they're very related, and we should focus on that.
Right. You can deter crime
Agreed.
by punishing the crime or threatening to punish the crime, or you can deter crime by, taking away the motive to commit the crime in the first place.
Yes.
They're not desperate.
Some crimes.
Sometimes,
They have to
Yeah,
be
some.
Well,
money.
when I say deter, I'm not saying 100%.
Right, but it's only for some crimes too. It's not going to deter people who.
Of course, you can't deter all crimes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. This is all a matter of degrees.
Yeah.
And unlike white collar crime, it's obviously not something that's going to be deterred by
Yeah.
basic income
Right,
because that's
exactly.
not millionaires.
Yeah,
So,
right. Yeah, so some, but a lot of, I think, I wish I was like more knowledgeable, but I think even a lot of the murders are related to kind of organized crime. So, the connection with money and different crimes is a big swath of them.
So
I
it's
think.
it's
Yeah.
not
And there's
just
also like
Not unilateral.
wives and husbands fighting over
That's
money.
true, yeah.
And so if you don't have that issue anymore, then they're
it's also sometimes people die as something that's incidental to another crime that's being committed, like someone stealing something, and the reason they're stealing
Right.
something
Yep.
is maybe because it's related to the fact that they don't have enough money, that kind of thing. So
Right.
so it can kind of
Yeah.
sneak its way into a lot of these things.
I wanted to sort of connect a couple of threads. I think that I'm glad that you pointed out, Alex, that there are different sort of motivations that people talk about.
Right.
There's deterrence, there's punishment, there's rehabilitation, and there's public safety. And I think a lot of a lot of it is driven by a desire for retribution and punishment. That's a powerful emotion that people
Right.
have, the desire for that. But I think, in fact, legally, and if you ask the prosecutors, they would say, "Oh no, it's about public safety, it's about deterrence." But I think there's a real conflict there, and I think that I think it's like the vast majority of people who go into prison come back out. And so, in fact, I think there's a good argument that it's not keeping us safer, because people come out not rehabilitated, they come out way worse off than they went in. They come out traumatized.
Right, yes.
And I think that we could have a lot more safety. I think it's not true that the police and the prisons are mostly keeping us safe.
Right.
And I really like I'm glad that you guys pointed out. I hadn't made that connection, but I think one thing a basic income could do would be make more. I mean, you could think of it as deterrence, but another thing it would allow is more opportunities for people to be in a position to make restitution.
Sure.
Um,
And not having to depend on a system that's maybe going to judge them for having been convicted of a crime.
Well, yeah.
So if you get out of prison and you apply for a job and you have a conviction on your record, you're usually not going to get that job. People who leave prison, they don't really have a way to get back on their feet,
Right.
except sometimes by turning to crime again.
Right.
That's a good point.
Yeah. So even if there was no effect of basic income on like the initial crime rate or something, once people got out, it would still have a very large effect, I think, on
Recidivism.
recidivism.
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, in the article, they talked about only letting certain prisoners go to that island. I mean, there was a waiting period. I think it was a 5-year waiting period.
their last 5 years.
If you had less
Yeah,
than
that's
5
right.
years left on
Yeah.
your sentence,
Yeah,
you would
so
be
I mean-
eligible. Yeah.
They are selected in that way.
Yep.
I wonder where they were before, though.
Uh,
Not really saying.
Well, no, it did. It
Interesting.
talked about the other prisons in Norway.
Oh.
Yeah.
And are they? I mean, they're obviously not like this one. But are they as bad as ours?
Well, here, let me read you a quote from the article. Instead of wings and landings, they lived in small pod communities within the prison, limiting the spread of the corrosive criminal prison subculture that dominates traditionally designed prisons. The teacher explained that all prisons in Norway worked on the same principle, which he believed is the reason why the country had at less than 30% the lowest reoffending figures in Europe and less than half the rate of the UK. So there's another. No, this is more a description of the prison on the island.
Yeah.
But I do know that even in the regular prisons, they had their own toilets and their own showers in their cells and access to computers and stuff like that.
Oh.
Even just the regular prisons.
Okay.
Yeah. So that's a big difference. But then there's also the question of, Norway is a much smaller country. So here's another quote from the article, which is that Norway has a population of slightly less than 5 million, a 12th of the UK's, and it has fewer than 4,000 prisoners.
Yeah.
And there are around 84,000 in the UK. So, we could ask the question of to what extent could the model in Norway actually be scaled up to a country like ours? Yeah, go ahead, Richard.
Well, the U.S. has the most prisoners in the entire world, even less than China, which is 4 times the population. And, well,
You mean more than China?
yeah, more than China.
Yeah.
Yeah, so that's an interesting thought too. Maybe if we had fewer prisoners, our prisons could be more efficient.
Yeah,
And
many of them
make
are
their use of
there for
resources.
drug charges and things like that.
Right. And then there's a question I've always wondered about. So in terms of I don't know that deterrence and punishment are necessarily two different things. Because why do we punish? Yeah, go ahead, Bethany.
Well, I think that what Nick pointed out is important, which is that the emotions surrounding punishment are not always that sensitive to the factors that are the most effective for deterrence. And so those, in that sense, the two things can come apart.
But the emotions ultimately do come from, this need to deter this kind of stuff. Like, that's why we punish.
That's right,
culturally
but,
and
It's like
psychologically.
evolutionary psychology article.
Yeah. I mean, I agree with that, but I think that it still matters that in practice, like the family or the victims or whatever might have a strong desire for retribution. I mean, to be fair and to be putting a positive spin on this a little bit or something, when you don't have institutions that do any punishment, you tend to have even more bloodshed and problems because people can take retribution into their own hands sometimes, and you end up with feuds and this kind of stuff. So there is some advantage to this idea that it's at least not just supposed to be about revenge, but I agree that's still in the mentality of it.
But I don't like that. It could be worse. So
I was only just pointing out it's not just about revenge, I guess. There are these other things mixed in. It's supposed to be about the fact that it's supposed to be about something else provides some constraint.
I think the closer you get to
Yeah.
the victim, the more it's about revenge, and then the
Right.
further away, it's more about justice and deterrence.
So I want to go to Elizabeth.
But not always, because there are places that have done restorative justice successfully, and there are times when victims are killing this person who murdered my father isn't going to bring back my father. It's just causing more death. I don't want this. And you have the public, whether it's the town or whoever, being no, this person did a terrible thing. We should punish them, which is really not about deterrence, because it's often about death penalty cases where it's okay, it's either life without parole or death penalty. It's not. There's not a deterrence factor. That's what victims vary. There are victims who are nope, I definitely want this person to die because he did this terrible thing, or I want them to be in jail for life. But there are ways that you can do things that are more about rehabilitation, and then are even about restitution, but that aren't so about punishment. It's if someone is really repentant for what they've done, you're I'm really sorry. What can I do to try to make this up to you? And often that's easier in sort of material crimes, when it's okay, you stole a thing, maybe you can do some community service and mow this person's lawn for free all summer or whatever. It gets more complicated when it's things that you can't fix, having killed someone. But that's also the minority of crimes. A lot of crimes are just speeding tickets or things that aren't even really crimes, or it's oh, you're in prison because you can't pay your bail. We've also criminalized so much activity, which is one of the things that's super busted about the system is like, well, you're just loitering, or you're just like being like you're just essentially like you are homeless. And we've criminalized that by being like, oh, you're not allowed to be in these public spaces, and so there's a lot of things that we could decriminalize that wouldn't actually impact public safety. It might impact like public aesthetics, but
Yeah, it's a good point.
So that's an interesting point that we do kind of punish on different levels. Like there's the individual, anger and, feeling of, wanting to revenge, that kind of thing. And then there's also kind of your culture and your community and the norms of punishment and that kind of thing.
Right.
Sultan.
The article mentions, Andreas Bejevic, something like that. The killer of 77 people. I watched a documentary. They asked to one of victims' father, because maybe also article mentions same thing. In Norway, the
Maximum
the
sentence
most
is 21 years.
21 years. They asked to the father if it's fair or not, if he can be merciful for this person. He was not revengeful at all. He said, it's enough. I think we should educate people first to convince them making people in prison for a long time is not a good way to reduce their pain.
So what's
Sorry.
Sorry for my
No.
English.
No, can I take a guess? Are you from Turkey?
Yes.
Nasılsınız?
İyiyim, teşekkürler.
Turkey.
So a question that I have is, what is the right maximum sentence for a prisoner and why? Anyone have any opinions?
I mean,
Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, I mean, I think for me, like, part of what is helpful to keep clear is some of the things Elizabeth was bringing up. Like, there are things I don't even think should be illegal. There are things that I take really seriously, like killing 71 people. For like killing 71 people, let's say somebody killed like 100 people's children or something like this, something that like I feel very strongly about not happening. I feel like I can't answer that without actually knowing some more empirical stuff.
Yeah.
Because part of what would inform me is the actual empirics of deterrence. Because that would be one of my main aims is thinking about like the effect on future children that could or could not get killed. And I don't really know if people's sort of deterrence sensitivity maxes out at 20 years or not, or what is the most effective kind of deterrence
You mean
there?
for the person being kept in prison is deterrent?
Well, it's not really about that person in
Right.
my thought
No, I
experiment.
know,
It's
I
about
just
the
wondered
next
if you were-
person
yeah,
who
you're-
is or
yeah.
is not deterred by that guy's sentence of being this or that long.
Oh, I see.
And I guess I don't
Really
really.
having to do with how they perceive it.
Yeah, I guess that's how I'm thinking about it. Like does it matter if they go to prison at all, if it's 20 years, if it's 40 years, like does that change the number of kids that get killed in the
Yeah.
future? I feel like I'd need to see more research. I don't actually know.
Yeah, then be careful about the zipper.
Oh, for the microphone, yeah.
Yeah.
So I don't know. I don't know if maybe somebody else has a different kind of answer, but
Yeah. Richard, do you have a comment from before?
Well, there's a comment on cost. Well,
Yeah.
if you pay a basic income of say $12,000, it's a lot less than the 32 or whatever $1,000 than you would pay per year. But for paying for their upkeep, yes. And in the U.S. there's a death penalty, and you have to pay so much for trials and things like that, and that's sometimes more than what you would pay for the life sentence. And the life sentence, if you don't have a 21-year maximum or whatever, then it would cost a lot more than that. Say if they're in prison since they're a teenager for the next 70 years or something, then
So you're comparing the cost of prison to the cost of basic income. So what is the substitution there? So today we would send someone to prison. Presumably we wouldn't just give the person a basic income instead of prison. Like that's not an
but
equivalent
prior
thing.
to prison or
Right,
after
to prevent them from going.
like
to
as a
prison.
preventative
I see.
thing. Yeah.
Yeah. Would you have a comment?
No, I mean, I'm thinking about what your question was about the maximum
Yeah.
possibility, and having just watched the Ted Bundy case on Netflix, thinking about people like that and what maximum what could there possibly be? I mean, there isn't any real maximum for people who will continue to do that.
Yeah.
So I think it depends on the crime. I mean, and we have that system. There are X number of years for this
Right.
kind of thing, and misdemeanors are,
Right.
less than murders and so forth.
Right.
So I'm not sure how
Okay.
to.
So
answer
maybe
that question.
no hard maximum, you would say.
Yeah,
Yeah.
I think, but then those evaluations are tricky. I don't know, making them is already tricky for people to do.
Okay.
Yeah.
Pablo?
Yeah, so talking about how harsh our action should be. So I'll tell something about India. So India has seen a lot of mob violences where the mob takes the matter into its own hand. Now you have one particular case when I was in the northeastern part of India. So in my town, there were a lot of illegal Bangladeshi immigrants where the locals had a very negative view of them. And in one case, there was an allegation that a immigrant raped local woman, and that immigrant was in the jail. And what happened was that a mob stormed in the prison,
Yeah.
and they just went in and they shot the prisoner.
Right.
They didn't.
Yeah.
I mean, his trial was due for I guess another week or so, but they just stormed in the prison. Some community local leaders and they shot the guy.
Yeah, Wild West. Yeah.
Yeah, so if you go, you have to realize that the government may ease its stance, but just like Ted Bundy, someone for the person whose daughter got murdered by Ted Bundy, I mean, he's gonna want some sort of revenge. He's gonna look for retribution.
Oh yeah.
And if the state sort of eases off, there's a vacuum here. Someone's gonna, especially in a state like a country like United States where civilians have a lot of arms and ammunition. In here we don't have that. They'll just beat up the guy.
Yeah.
They'll hang him
Well, they have a lot
from
of
trees.
guns too. There are a lot of guns.
Yeah, I
in the
mean
United
someone's
States.
gonna do it.
Yeah, I know.
So you can't allow the situation to go like if you say that we're not gonna punish, we're gonna. And there's going to be response from citizens. You
Yeah.
don't want them to go to that extent.
Right.
So I guess you sort of have to appease the citizens in a way that we're being harsh towards extremely violent or violent offenders.
Yeah.
So you have to make the punishment harsh enough that the public isn't going to take it into their own hands.
Yeah.
I think it
That's
depends on the
interesting.
crime. Like if it's a really it's a violent offense, I don't think so. You can make an exception.
Yeah.
But yeah, for smaller crimes, let's say you catch someone selling marijuana in some states where it's illegal. Yeah, I think you can make it a softer sentence. But for violent offense, I think you need to keep in the interest of the public, where they want to see some retribution. Or
Yeah,
else
and
they take
that
matters
comes
into their own
in with
hands.
victim crimes. I mean, victimless crimes, drug taking.
So I want to
traffic
stick to
stops.
hand raising since a lot of people are raising.
Oh,
hands.
sorry.
I want to go to
Okay.
Slavo first.
Well, this is a very long topic, of
Okay.
course.
Yeah.
Especially some parts, like for example, you mentioned you compared the U.S. justice system to China, but that is a super long topic. And if you compare the U.S. to China, you have to take everything into consideration. And by that, I mean they have extremely different economic systems, political systems. For instance, everything is way stricter in China. They have a lot more rules and regulations. For instance, they have surveillance system, which is almost everywhere in China, and it works 24/7 on every street corner. You can be seen on a camera, right? So you have to take everything into consideration. And I guess my point is from that is that citizens in China are way different. They behave way differently. They're just different people than what we are used to seeing here, because they have surveillance there. Actually, the government in China just introduced a new point system, where I don't know if you heard of it, where they have a
Social
system.
credit.
Yeah, we've talked
Yeah.
about it here.
You did? Yeah, a point system where you're rewarded if, for example, you're in a public transport in a bus and you get up from your seat and you give it to, let's say, an old woman who needs it. So if you do that, you get points, and then with those points you get rewarded or punished. So I think it's a totally different situation. You can't just compare it saying China has way less prisoners because it's a totally different country. So I think you have to take all of those things into consideration. That's number one. Number two,
Richard's point was that like the U.S. has a higher incarceration rate than any country,
than any country. Yeah.
even the ones that are most similar, like much higher.
I'm saying the most populous countries like China, which has the highest amount of citizens, they have a totally different system. So you can't compare them. If you compare them to smaller countries, for example, my country has an extremely high crime rate. Maybe it's higher than the U.S. I'm not sure. So.
I think there's a historical shift, though, right? That might be illustrative here within the United States. Maybe Elizabeth or someone else knows this better than I do, but I think the prison population in the U.S. has gotten up quite exponentially in like the last number of decades. Do you know the details on
It
that?
went up by a factor of 5
Wow.
since the 70s.
So that might be a
Yeah,
better
yeah,
comparison. Because things have changed a little, but that's kind of a dramatic. And it seems like it was in response to certain policy changes, like the war on drugs, and not just like crime.
And the
rates.
3 strikes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So there might be that might be better than
I
trying to compare it to
understand,
another
I
country.
understand.
Yeah.
Also, another thing is, especially because I've seen other countries, how prisoners get back into the community after they get released from jail. You're right, I agree partially that there aren't many programs and many options, many organizations which help prisoners get back into the community. But I think in recent years, in the past few years, I think that's starting to grow. For example, I saw the Boston Celtics, the organization, they started to hire prisoners to do normal stuff in the arena in TD Garden. So I think it is increasing. So over time, I think more and more organizations will start helping prisoners get back into the community, get back into their city, and just get back with the rest of the society. So I think that is changing. It's not like black and white, and it's not as bad, I think, as some media sources say it is.
So I want to. You brought up the issue of surveillance, and I wanted to ask the question: to what extent? We've talked about the kind of the various benefits of prison, but to what extent can surveillance be substituted in for prison? And are there any situations in which it's better? Would we rather have does it make sense to ever sentence someone instead of 5 years in prison, 5 years of we're watching you or something like that? Yeah.
I think I could imagine that being one of the tools I would want to use more often. I guess it's already used to some extent with like ankle things.
Right.
But if you had somebody who was pretty responsive to whether they were going to get caught, so there might be certain very rare humans that would just go out and kill someone under surveillance anyway, but that's going to be rare.
Yeah.
So if your primary concern were to protect people from that individual, or like that was one of your main concerns, and you could track them and they're likely to be responsive to that and not harm anyone, then that seems to me like much better because they're not suffering as much as if they are in prison.
Yeah.
So in that sense, it seems like it could have a role.
Yeah.
Save people a lot of money.
So
That makes sense, but obviously everything has pros and cons, and the major con of what you said is that I know it sounds cliche, but we would lose the freedom because there will be no privacy whatsoever, right? If everything is under
Oh, I think he
surveillance,
was
we would
suggesting targeted, like not everybody,
Oh,
but like
oh.
you commit a crime, let's say you beat somebody up in a bar and people are worried you're going to do it again. Now you get something on you that surveils you.
Oh, the surveillance is for you?
Not everybody. but
Oh,
you
I thought like
specifically.
cameras. or
No,
something
I
like
think that was what you had in mind, right? So like.
I was thinking more.
Yeah, maybe can you explain
Targeted
it more?
to
Like,
you, yeah.
how would that work?
So
I don't
already
know.
they have like ankle bracelets, I guess, that you
Yeah.
have to wear, and then it's like when you're on probation, or I don't know if it's like part of your prison sentence, and they can see if you're, where you're going and what you're doing. So I guess maybe you're not allowed to leave the state sometimes, or maybe you have different.
Maybe
other
anything you
conditions.
do on your computer or your phone will be monitored, that kind of thing.
They can put a chip in. You're
That would
right.
be only if you commit a
Right.
crime already, right?
Right.
Yeah, exactly. So let's imagine like you were producing a lot of child pornography. They could probably surveil you in such a way that if you started to do that, they would know and be able to stop you from abducting the children or, that kind of thing, right?
Right. Exactly.
Yeah, that's a good idea.
Sorry to pick such
They
a
could-
terrible example.
they could-
I'm trying to pick examples where we'd be very concerned that like without this surveillance, some harm would happen. That would be like the part of the goal of it, maybe.
Right.
Yeah,
Yeah. It would prevent any crimes that you kind of had to prepare for.
Right,
And it would prevent any crimes that
You're not going to commit
wouldn't
if you're
do
going to get
if
caught.
You're going to get caught.
Yeah.
That kind of thing.
Yeah.
And certainly, if you're going to prison, you're under surveillance
Right.
all the time anyway.
Right.
So if the choice is between being under surveillance in a prison and being under surveillance and living your life as you otherwise would, I think, intuitively it feels like just choosing the surveillance is better. But then you get into the question of when judges are sentencing, are they going to make different decisions if they're only sentencing someone to surveillance or something like that?
More
Yeah.
hazard.
Go
Different
ahead,
decisions.
Elizabeth.
Surveillance gets sort of billed as like the kinder, gentler, like alternative to
Right.
prison, but it still is subject to a lot of those same sort of discriminatory things. Like, okay, maybe we'll just surveil these people in ways that don't actually. You're like, oh, it's fine. They're not really in prison, but they're still being monitored, and even this very awkward So okay, say that you're okay, you're not allowed to leave some area if it's I haven't realized or what the exact parameters of this are, then you can have this escalating effect now we need to actually send you to prison because you violated this. And you're like, well, okay, actually I didn't realize that this wasn't a town boundary, it was this 100 miles, whatever.
Yeah.
Especially if you're looking at populations that are perhaps not super well educated or don't have very good lawyers who don't explain to them the terms of their release, and so you get this escalating.
Yeah.
It also doesn't necessarily have the preventative effect that you want it to have. A lot of violence is domestic violence. So if you're oh, okay, we're going to know if you leave your house. Well, if you beat up your partner in your house, that's not. And are we going to then put cameras in and be oh, well, now we're watching you. And so it's okay, so now we're watching anyone who's in your house, the sort of spillover effects of that. So
It's a touchy topic.
Is it still worse than putting them in prison, though?
I mean, I think it's probably better because
Yeah.
prison is just such a toxic environment, especially in the U.S. So it's better. I still don't want it.
Right.
But
So you might be worried about what Alex was raising is if people were more liberal with sentencing people because it was surveillance instead of prison or something like that.
Well,
Were you raising
if
that
you're,
concern?
If you're a judge and you're oh, am I going to sentence this person to prison? Then you might, oh, I don't think they, you're going to weigh that heavily.
Yeah.
But if you're thinking, oh, it's just surveillance, I'm just going to sentence it to surveillance, you might end up sentencing more people. So it's not just that the same people who would have been in prison are under surveillance, there might be people who are under surveillance who wouldn't have
Doesn't
gone to
seem
prison
as
before.
bad, right?
Might be
Yeah.
fined.
That's a
or something.
concern,
Yeah.
maybe.
Go ahead, Ricardo.
And there are actually algorithms that judges use to sentence people, and they look at how many people, known criminals that they're associated with, and things and their race and stuff like that. Even though they're supposed to be non-biased, they just have a lot of data. And there's also law enforcement has these algorithms where since there are a lot more crimes in these minority neighborhoods and things like that, they patrol there more often and they pick up more people because of those algorithms. And so
Right.
it then increases the likelihood that they're going to patrol there, and so they keep.
Is that what you're going to say? Elizabeth?
I wasn't sure where you were going. So I was going to be those algorithms, you feed them garbage and they give you garbage. And so you feed them racist garbage and they
Pablo,
give
go
you
ahead.
racist
So
results.
these algorithms, I presume they're machine learning algorithms. So they're based on the past data. So if most of your incarcerations, something similar, like Amazon used that to predict, find suitable candidates for hiring. So the problem with that was that most of the candidates who were working, they hired, or most of the people working in Amazon were male. So that algorithm was spewing out, results which were 81% male. It was biased towards male because the
Right,
algorithm learned that, most of the people working in this company are males. You know what? Maybe males are better suited for working in Amazon. Same
Right.
thing is with that, that algorithm. I don't remember which state it was, but the problem is that it was biased towards selecting African Americans for the crime. But yeah, I think that's a different issue. That's one way a state is using technology in criminal justice, but I think a surveillance model would be much better, but I'm not sure how political it can get in the United States, because if you use that sort of stuff in India, it can be used as a political tool. You want to monitor the opposition. You're in power. You don't want people Now, you can just file a case against them, a bogus one, and you can put them on surveillance. So the misuse of that sentence is also an issue. I'm not sure how political, how the justice and politicians separate in the United States, but in India, they're pretty much connected.
That is interesting. And then there's a question of if you have someone under surveillance, that might prevent them from committing crimes. You don't want them to commit more crimes. But to what extent does it serve the punishment purpose of
Or the
prison,
deterrence,
or the
yeah.
deterrence purpose? If people are like, oh, if I get caught, I'll just have to be under surveillance and not commit crimes anymore, right?
Right.
Yeah, go ahead, Richard.
And then there's the incentive that they, like with the juvenile detention center, they can like bribe judges to put people under surveillance, and so that they have all these cameras around, or ankle bracelets, like they had that with migrants, illegal immigrants, before they were put into immigration court. They had these ankle bracelets, and then and it costs like $500 a day or something like that. And so if you decide that they're going to put they put more people have their ankle bracelets, and so that the company would make all this money because
Right. It seems like you wouldn't even, this is a side point now, but you wouldn't really need an extra piece of technology. You could just have certain permissions on people's phones or something like that.
Yeah.
But yeah, the incentive structure is really important, like we're talking about with private prisons too, or even non-private. Like, yeah, who's making money off of someone else's misery is an important thing to look at. Were you going to say something, Joan? Did I?
No, I'm just thinking about basic income.
Right.
The relationship
Yeah, we
to
should
basic income.
bring it back to
I'll
that.
just
How it relates.
circle back to basic income in kind of a different way, which is that if we think of government spending the way I usually do for funding a basic income, you can fund a basic income if there's something that people can buy with the money. If there's the real resources in the economy that spending can actually go toward. And the same thing can be thought of for prison spending. Like if we have the resources to build and manage prisons, if there's labor available, if there's all the infrastructure available, or we can buy that stuff, then that means we can spend the money on prisons. So then the question comes up: does it make sense in terms of efficiency to actually have any private prisons at all? Is that actually helping the government save anything? It helps them save money, but if they don't need to save money, if what they need to save is resources, then can they manage those resources directly instead of hiring private companies to do it? Zlatko.
I think privatizing it would give more business opportunities to the people themselves, so there is a positive thing in it. Privatizing anything, whether it's prisons or whatever it is, would offer business opportunities.
Is it always a good thing to create business opportunities for people?
Depending on the situation, but sometimes it is.
I tend to look at it as
I go on a case-to-case basis.
Yeah.
So the way I would think about it is like if Apple is making money, they're making money by selling us phones that hopefully we like to use at least. So there's some alignment of social welfare and the profit motive of the company. The concern I have about that same model being applied to a prison is that the natural way in which it's going to be trying to make money, at least how it's set up now, is by more people going to prison. And so even if you only have a small amount of political influence or other kinds of things, you could be that would outweigh the idea that more people, for me, the fact that more people are getting kind of these opportunities to start a business or something.
Also, the idea of creating business opportunities to me sounds a little bit like the idea of creating jobs for people to do. Now, if you have, if the labor market demands labor because that's what the economy, that's what the markets are needing and stuff like that, that's great. But then as soon as you start creating jobs for people as a way to get them incomes, or you start creating business opportunities for people as a way for them to be successful, now you're creating businesses and you're creating jobs that wouldn't exist in an efficient economy. So that's something that concerns me too. And specifically what Bethany said, like the product here is like you get more people into your prisons, et cetera, et cetera.
Right.
It doesn't sound like it's aligned with the benefit of the consumer. Go ahead, Richard.
There are people who have there are prison riots over food, and there's a few months ago there was a story about an Alabama sheriff who just fed his prisoners cheap food. Then he was able, under a Depression era law, to keep the money that was left over at the end of the budget. And so he had bought this like $200,000 beach house or something like that. And so there's an incentive if you prioritize profits over people to just provide them with horrible treatment.
Right.
And things like
That's
that.
a good point. Yeah.
Yeah. Pablo.
Yeah, so as you mentioned, like jobs, they would be creating, like if you privatize prisons. I mean, it's profits benefiting a few individuals, like who can afford to get in that market. They're already rich. Like if someone gets out of private prison, they're already rich. The people they can hire, I mean, how many people will they hire?
No, you don't get it. It's not that. It's not that people would be. I'm talking about in general, like privatizing, whether it's the military or prisons. The thing is, it won't be government owned anymore, and that is what I support. If people were able to buy, for example, buy a prison or become an arms dealer and work for the U.S. military, like it happened a decade ago, I think it would be better if it's in the hands of the people rather than in the hands of the government. Because right now, the government, as you said, only 10% of prisons are privately owned.
It's 7%
Or no,
of state and 18% of federal.
Okay. So I would think if like more prisons were privately owned rather than owned by the government, that would be better for
So the question
everyone in general.
is how do we manage the resources that are available to us as a society? How do we manage those resources most effectively? And I think we can all agree that some resources are better managed by the free market, and then some resources are better managed by the government in representing the collective interests of the people.
Public goods.
Yeah, exactly.
What?
Public
goods,
you said.
for example.
Yeah, Richard, go ahead.
Well, there's an example of Michael Cohen, the president's former lawyer. He's going to a white-collar former a Jewish prison. I'm not sure if it's private or public owned, but it's for 3 years. Is that what's the how strict of a punishment is that? Is that how all these special prisons for various levels of crime and things like that?
Are you asking whether we feel it's an appropriate punishment?
Yes.
Maybe it's not an appropriate punishment, but that's not what I'm saying. I'm saying that prisons should be privately owned, but obviously the punishment is a totally different thing. They should be punished based on the crime. So based on your case, what you said about Michael Cohen, he was probably inappropriately punished. He should be punished more, maybe. So. But that's not that's up to the prison itself to decide, right?
Or up to
the judge, obviously.
Okay, Pablo.
Yeah, so like you mentioned, I think all of us, like Americans especially, would agree that privatizing the military now has created an industry which only thrives, which if you go to war, that explains why United States is always on war, because there's an industry which depends, if you don't have wars, this industry will die. So they have interest to keep the wars going. Same thing would happen to the prisons. Now, a firm's main objective is to improve profit. So if they're going to turn down, they're going to work on bringing down costs. If you're spending, let's say, $4,000 a month on one inmate, your job as a firm is going to bring that down. So you can bring down expenses. That means you're going to spend less on an inmate if you make it privatized, because you have an incentive to make profits out of it. Now you're treating the inmates worse off. I mean, not necessarily. Maybe you might come up with a system that you spend less, you give them more benefits, but I think a private system would focus more on profits, and I think they might even lobby with the criminal justice system to put more people in the prisons.
Yeah, it's those kinds of incentives that I'm really concerned about
Yeah.
too, because there's no appropriate. Well, with the prison, there's no appropriate customer that's keeping the quality at a certain level. I mean, the government theoretically could, but it's so.
One interesting thing, like in India, although the prisons are owned by the government, but some high-profile prisoners, for example, I mean, there's a law which says every prisoner is going to be treated similarly. But if you go down to rural parts of the country, you'll notice that powerful and influential people will get special rights for them in the prison. You go and some politician who was convicted in some graft case, he's gonna have a room full of TV. He's gonna have special rights. He's gonna have special visit. His wife may come, visit, stay with him for a couple of days. That's not gonna happen. So in a private system, you might see that, hey, you want a deluxe cell, you know what, you can pay us for it. I'm not sure if that's gonna be good or bad, but we see that in my country.
Well, so here's a thought. If everyone had a basic income, so every prisoner had money to spend, would you start to see the incentives? If you have private prisons, could you see the private prisons trying to, come to our prison because we're gonna, provide you the best stuff at the best prices?
Are people allowed to choose their prison in the system? Because right now I don't think you get to choose which prison.
Well,
you
yeah, I'm
go to.
imagining a world in which there's private prisons and they're competing for prisoners, and prisoners get to decide which prison they
And
go
they
to.
have basic income.
Yeah.
Advertisements about
Yeah.
I don't know. I mean, I think that's interesting, and I think it would help with it could help with the quality of life issue. It doesn't necessarily help with the perverse incentive to have more prisoners issue, which I'm still really concerned about, because that would still mean more customers for the prisons. Well, if they're making money from the prisoners choosing to go there or give them money or something, then they still want more prisoners.
They can't make money if there are no prisoners.
Right.
Right.
Prisoners are the customers, basically.
Yeah, exactly.
Right.
And yeah,
Right.
so that isn't
But
great.
I mean, if they are getting a basic income, I was thinking too that when they're inside, they can make choices like food and
right.
they can be customers in that way. It may not make
Right.
sense to have the customers to choose the prison,
Yeah.
but once they're in there, they can make choices.
Choices
with
or
basic
something.
income.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Like they said in the article, how they were able to were provided one meal per day, and then they could make their own meals after that, and they could earn £6 worth of income per day.
Yeah, and they had a supermarket
Yeah.
in the prison on the island
Yeah, so
that
that's a
people
way
would
to
shop
have
at and
customers.
buy their food. Yeah.
Yeah.
So I don't know how that was set up in terms of are these businesses there just to make money, or are they providing a token supermarket with reasonable prices, so that people can get used to going to the grocery store and buying their groceries
Right.
and that kind of thing. It didn't get into how that's all set up.
Right.
I don't
Yeah.
know if these are private businesses that are set up on the island, that are there for
Right.
profit.
I guess the degree to which you have private companies being able to have strong influences on the government is relevant here too, because
Yeah.
if that's not the case, then the risk is lower. I don't know what it's like in Norway.
Yeah, so certainly, like Zlatko was saying, you can imagine a world in which the judges decide the sentence and the private prisons are just handling that part of it,
Right.
and there's no kind of influence coming
Right.
back. But then you can imagine a world in which, either directly or indirectly, the private prisons are maybe funding, criminal justice education to train
Right.
judges to sentence more harshly, that kind
Right.
of thing. And
The way there's
I don't know
yeah.
if there's a way to get rid of all of that.
Yeah, it's hard.
So that's something
It's-
that's
it's
concerning.
tricky, yeah.
I think private prison depends. There can be two ways. Depends on who's paying. If the primary customer is the government, the government says that we're going to pay X amount of money to take care of these prisoners, then they're going to try to reduce the expenses per prisoner. With the customer is prisoner itself, then they're going to try to provide some lavish luxuries to these prisoners. Like, hey, we're going to treat you good, we're going to treat you fair, etc. etc.
Right. Yeah, or if you somehow funded them without it being that I don't know how you would do this, but they don't get more money per prisoner past a certain number or something like this.
So here's if they don't get more money per prisoner, then they're still going to try to lower how much they spend on each prisoner. Right, that doesn't really fix that.
That's true.
But the question is, so here's
But they
another
might
question.
also
which
try
is,
to lower the number.
we keep talking as if what we want is the prisoners to be treated better. What do we want the private prisoners to do? Because the better you treat them, the less of a punishment that is. So that's
We were talking about before.
Yeah.
I think it's tough because.
So
sorry. go ahead.
what does our ideal prison look like? Does it look like the island in Norway, or what?
Well, I think I might split our current one-size-fits-all solution to a lot of different solutions for different kinds of crimes and different kinds of situations.
Yeah.
A little bit like what we've been talking about. so it's kind of hard for me to answer. Like if I got to like wave a wand and control things, there's a lot of things that wouldn't be crimes anymore at all. And then there'd be like, so that's one whole swath of prisoners. And then there's like other things where I would think of maybe what like Elizabeth was saying about or maybe Nick was about like financial restitution and kind of like theft. Maybe I wouldn't put anyone in prison for theft, So like, and then I don't know, maybe like mass murderers who you had to worry about going around and murdering, and I'm really worried about deterrence. Like, I don't know, maybe I'd have a much smaller system.
How do you prevent theft?
Restitution that's significant enough, and then a good baseline. I think that's really important. Like, I think if you have a lot of poverty, you're really in trouble with theft. So I'd like to like target the poverty as a primary way, I guess. And then if you have to pay it back in some way, then someone who's not desperate is pretty already disincentivized. Like, why am I going to steal someone's iPhone if I have to like make it up to them later?
So you're assuming that it's going to be very easy to get caught in this scenario too.
Well, you could make the restitution many times more, I guess, to some degree, and still not have it be prison. Yeah. Sorry.
That's okay. What was I going to say now?
Oh,
Richard?
No. Check my face. Wait. Give me one more.
We're talking about different kinds of
I was
crimes.
going to say that what you're talking about, though, really requires a change back in law and back in the way that people are sentenced, and that becomes very complicated. It's not really about the prison per se, or what it looks like or how it.
That's true.
Really,
yeah.
Because if we're talking about different degrees of crimes and deserving different things, then we're talking about law, changes in law.
That's a good point. Yeah.
Well, I think it was last year at the beginning of the year, Trump intervened in these two shoplifters cases in China, and they were going to get like 2-year sentences for shoplifting, and
Were they Americans?
Yes, they're
Okay,
like basketball players or something like that.
They're college kids, something.
Yeah, and so this is the severity of crimes. This severity of punishment for like minimal crimes.
Sorry, are you talking about LiAngelo Ball, the basketball player, the college basketball player? Yes.
Yeah.
Okay. Sorry, continue.
And well, there's a really severe crime in China for a severe punishment for a minor crime in the U.S. really justified. And well, if you punish someone severely, and how do I say it? Oh, the private prisons could bribe lawmakers to increase the punishment for minor crimes so that they can earn more money for the punishments. Yes.
Yeah.
Which is what they basically.
But it is a different country though, so it is the Chinese law. They punish them based on Chinese law. It was three basketball players, college, from UCLA. They all got suspended, and then 2 of them voluntarily left UCLA because they weren't able to continue with the basketball program there. But they still could have stayed there to study, but they just couldn't continue with the basketball program. The fact is, most of the punishment that they received was not from the United States, but was from China. Basically, all the punishment from the U.S. was UCLA suspending them from the basketball program. That's all they suffered. But on the other hand, in China, because they broke Chinese laws and they are way more stricter compared to American laws, that's why they suffered all those bad consequences. Because in China, if you steal something, you suffer way more severe consequences.
I think that was Richard's point, though, that like there's a really big difference in the
I would say China is maybe worse with these rules and regulations.
Wasn't
compared to
that
the
your
US.
point? I think that was his point a little bit. Yeah,
Did
I
they
think
go to
you guys were
prison?
saying the same.
Is that what
Yeah,
you said?
it's like 2 or 3 years.
Yeah.
Just for stealing $100 glasses, I think it was.
Yes.
I mean, that raises the issue of how cultural the punishments are too.
Right.
I mean, we're trying to decide what punishments should be, but actually, in different countries, they're very different.
Right.
Yeah. So exactly. At the end of the day, for some crimes, the U.S. isn't punishing that.
Right.
They're not that.
Oh, you can get your hand cut off in some other countries.
Right.
Yeah.
Like I was.
Yeah. Not their hand, yeah.
What do you think?
What kind of crime was not punished in USA?
In that
Shoplifting.
case, shoplifting, like stealing from a store. There was an American player, and he went from the U.S. to China. And then, while he was in China, he stole sunglasses. And in China, if you steal sunglasses from a store, if you shoplift, you get punished way more when compared to the U.S.
I think
If you steal sunglasses here, you won't get punished.
It's a
that much.
misdemeanor if it's under a certain amount of money, I think.
Yeah.
So it's really not that big of a crime in the
So
US.
you can
still
Here.
Here.
In the
Still
US,
get
but in
jail
China,
time.
it's a big deal. Yeah.
Yeah.
So isn't it interesting that you've got all these different cultures that have settled on different norms of
Yeah.
punishment, and for the most part, they all work well enough that they're not, like trying to adjust their norms to some sort of optimum or something like
Right.
that.
Right.
So then the question is, what would that optimum be? Is there an optimum?
Optimum what? Punishment?
Optimum, rule for how severe punishments
Oh.
should be for various crimes and stuff like that.
Well, I'm not sure I totally follow your point. I mean, there's sort of like my own personal values about what I think. I don't know that everyone would
guess
agree with me,
my
so I don't know
question
what
is,
you call
what's,
an
what's
optimum.
best for a society? Like,
Right.
Zlatko mentioned that maybe the way that China does it is not the best, but what is the best?
Right. Well, I think that depends on how one weights different things. So I guess that's why I'm struggling with your question. Well, I don't know that there's an answer to that.
In
The-
America or globally?
In a hypothetical,
Like,
ideal
what's your
society.
what's your
Utopia.
currency?
Yeah.
What's your currency? Like, what would maximize well-being? Because I think we don't have enough information.
What would
to know.
maximize? Yeah, what would maximize the well-being of your people in your society?
I mean, I think I can only guess.
Right.
Like I don't
I
really
mean, you don't
know.
need to give me like specific numbers. It's just like what kinds of things should we be thinking about? Like what should we be weighing, right? Elizabeth.
Well, so then you would need to think about like, so what's the actual harm to society that this is
Mhm.
causing?
Right.
And thinking like, okay, so then like I don't know, I'm like imagining writing some complicated econometric formula and like,
Right.
okay, so that's like some variable, and then but then there's something about like the motivation for like why people are doing so like that's vary for different, because it's like, okay, so there's the deterrence part of like what sentence would actually deter people, but that's maybe not like a sentencing issue. That's so that I can't figure out how to like make a formula for that. But there's something about the harm to society, but then something about the why is someone doing that. So we should think, oh, what's the optimum way to like that there's like some sort of like a punishment, but also a deterrence. Like, is your question like what's the optimum way to deter?
I guess I feel like we've already been thinking about this all the way along, so I'm trying to figure
Yeah.
out what's new from what you're asking, or if you're trying to get at something different from what we've all kind of already been talking
Maybe
about.
I'm just summing up everything we've already been talking about into one single question.
Right. I don't know. I just want to make sure I understand
yeah.
what you're saying.
What Elizabeth was just saying reminds me of something that I feel like kind of gets at something that I've been wanting to bring up in this conversation, which is, I mean, answer your question was, what should be how should we set these
Right.
Yeah.
penalties?
Yeah.
And I think for me, that kind of, like, I wouldn't want to answer that question in isolation from this question of, like, when something goes wrong, right? When somebody steals something from somebody else's house, like, what are the other options for handling that situation?
Other than
Right.
what? Prison?
Yeah, and I think that, I'd like to live in a community where there was some mechanism to say, like, well, what's going on with this guy?
Yeah.
Like, what is the reason?
Yeah.
Like, is it because he's like desperate for $100,
Right.
or is it because he feels, mad at his neighbor?
Yeah, is he like mad his neighbor wants to punish him? Is he like
And-
really poor
and
and trying to like resell this to feed his family? Is he like addicted to drugs?
Sending him to
Like,
jail doesn't address any of those things.
Well, it never does.
And
That's the problem.
And I think one of the maybe a community that had where people were getting a universal basic income would have, not just would it relieve the pressure that he might be feeling that he's desperate for $100, but maybe his neighbors would have like a little more free time to tune into what's going on with him. And another thing we haven't brought up is that a lot of people who are locked up because they can't get mental health treatment.
I was just gonna say that, yeah.
And
Absolutely.
and that's that's another example of something where it's just like a sort of a broken system because the resources aren't being allocated well.
And we're going backwards to the law, to justice, and to mental health issues, and those are really pre-prison. Those are not to do with how the prisons look, feel, or how people act within them. They're really how they got there. And we don't address mental health issues. And there are many mentally ill people in prison, and addicts. Many addicts, well, once they're in prison,
I think you're going too far if you say that prison doesn't solve any of the problems, because not all people who go to prison have mental health issues, right?
No, but,
So-
but
so
whatever
for-
the
I think he had
problem
a
was,
mental
like whatever the
health
underlying problem for that guy, it's not addressed by sending him to prison.
Well, for example, if you're a sane person, right? If you're completely 100% sane, you don't have any mental health issues, right? And you go and you commit a crime, for example, you rob a bank, right? And then if you go to prison, when you get out of prison, maybe that prison experience would change your lifestyle and you would not be looking to commit crimes again.
But don't you think
Is
it's
that a
just
possibility?
don't you think it's-
There's a
Well, then
possibility
we
for that,
want
right?
to emphasize.
Maybe.
But there's maybe at least as high likelihood it would make you more likely to rob a bank.
Yeah.
Well, we don't know that.
No, we
It just
do.
depends on the individual. But
I think there's decent research on this question.
Yeah.
So if you were designing a prison not as deterrence at all, but just to like change someone's behavior after, I think you would design a very, very different.
No, but yeah, I agree with that. But I think there are many cases where people would go to prison and then after prison they would come as a totally different person with a changed lifestyle, with a better lifestyle for their community and the society. So that's what I'm saying. There are some good cases. It's not all
Right.
black and
So-
white.
That might
And,
be-
and
Right.
there
I
are
mean-
some.
I think there are cases like that. I think you're right. I think there are far more cases where people leave prison and society doesn't have a place for them,
Right.
and sometimes going back to prison is almost like they can get back to something that's normal,
Well,
that's structured, that they
yeah.
have food at least. or
I don't
something
know a
like
lot
that.
about
Yeah.
this, but in addition to the emotional difficulty that Nick was bringing up, like you build a certain set of skills and social networks that have everything to do, I assume, more with committing crimes than with like what you could develop, right? And then you're out and nobody wants to hire you because you are a felon. So like that's kind of a double whammy, and you don't have a basic income, and so like.
And Richard, you sent me an
Yeah.
article about Japan, right?
Japan and Korea.
Japan and
Two
Korea.
different articles.
Yeah, where people were trying to get into prison or that kind of thing.
Trying to get in? Why?
Because they don't have enough money and
Oh,
they lack social companionship
Yeah.
and then they threaten people with knives or they steal $2 worth of relish or something like that and then they get thrown in prison for 2 years.
Right. And they
Right.
get meals, and they get a place to stay, and yeah.
So I had a friend who was in prison for a number of years. This is just kind of an anecdote that is not necessarily relevant to the discussion, but one of his jobs was, so there's a law that they can't eat the same food every dinner, every night. So one of his jobs was to take these boxes of dinners and label them 7 different things. They're all the same, but he labels like the Monday, dinner, Tuesday, he labels them all different things, and that was just one of his jobs that he had to do as a prisoner. One of his responsibilities. Yeah, Nick.
I think there's an interesting. I've heard a couple times, just in the popular media about. I think an interesting example. I think it's been tried in other places, but I think it was pioneered in Richmond, California, where they had it's a city in the Bay Area that had a very high rate of
Gun violence.
people shooting each other. And they had basically big success. This is, kind of a little bit of a exaggeration or a cartoon, but they figured out who was doing it. They figured out a very, very narrow demographic that was very disproportionately responsible for these violence, and they basically paid them to stop shooting each other, and it worked dramatically.
Yeah.
And there was a kind of a framework around it. They invited them to meetings at City Hall and had name cards for them. They're like,
They gave
yes,
them
Mr.
trips to Disney World and things.
What's that?
They gave them trips to Disney World and
And
things.
it was a tiny amount of money. It was we're gonna give you these gift cards because we're enrolling you in this program. This community really needs your leadership. And it took a really small payment
No.
to
they were
Get
not
them to stop doing it.
well,
It's a
they
more
were
big
just
difference.
killing each other for money, right?
No, they were. It was just like
Gang violence, maybe.
What is
Or,
that?
yeah, it was like reputational
Yeah, yeah.
disputes. You know, it was like beefs over.
yes.
But it also gave them some prestige to,
Right.
it wasn't just the money, right? In fact, maybe it wasn't even the money. It was more about having a role.
I think so.
I wonder if part of it was having an out,
Right.
saying
Yeah.
like, oh well, we have this option now.
Right.
Now now I don't have to like, in order to defend
Yes.
my reputation, have to keep killing people
Right.
because now everybody's kind of doing this thing. We're all given an out, and we don't have to answer to this whatever
Right.
weird feud that was going
It's like
on.
I would avenge you, but then I won't get my gift card. Sorry.
Right. It's like everyone can understand that. Well, of course, you won't get your gift card. That's, yeah.
That's really interesting.
It is interesting. Yeah, Richard.
We were talking before about how people don't have a place for themselves after they're released from prison. Well, there's an example in Breaking Bad about how this guy, Jesse Pinkman's friends, one of his friends was put in prison, and so they wanted someone to take the fall instead of him, and so they paid him $80,000 because he spent the last 50 years of his life in prison, and he couldn't function outside of prison. So he wanted like $80,000 to go back into prison or something like that. And so if you don't have a
This is a fictional story.
yes.
Yeah, fiction. Breaking Bad was.
Nick, do you have an article on that example? Or?
I can send you some stuff.
It kind of reminds or
But
relates
as you
to.
said, it's kind of cartoonish, and it might not necessarily work in most cases.
But I feel like it's an
It's
example
alternative.
of this. I
Alternative.
think we're very stuck in this
people
paradigm
can use
of
it,
evil people need to be.
It's an
yeah,
example of
prevention.
It is another option. That,
Yeah.
It's an example of looking at the specific situation and figuring out what needs to be
Right.
done to address that specific situation.
Right.
And
Yeah.
there's no such thing as a situation that approach will not work with. It
Right.
just will look different for each one.
I guess
Yeah.
an interesting question that raises for me is like, how do you balance, I guess, the benefit of kind of a unified set of laws across a society, or like a unified set of expectations, with the fact that these kind of approaches seem like they need to be really tailored to like exactly what's going on. I imagine there's some kind of answer, but that tension arises in my mind. Like, we have this kind of movement towards centralized law. Yeah.
Well, and is there a way that you can maybe reframe as sort of like, oh, if we have like, uniform expectations, but like, okay, so, can our expectations be like, well, this action is not something that you should do, and so like, you should come up with some sort of restitution instead of being like, oh, well, we should have like a, like mandatory minimum sentence for this. Like,
Right.
are there, or ways that we can reframe, like, okay, this is a bad thing, like we should find some way to like get people to stop doing that thing and sort of moving away from like, oh, well, we definitely have to like imprison people for X, but to be like, we all agree X is bad. We should work together to find creative ways to stop people from doing X.
There are creative judges out there. I mean,
Like the
I've seen a
Bambi,
few on YouTube. Yeah.
like that Bambi thing.
What is that?
Well, the guy shot a deer, and so he has to watch Bambi every day.
No, there's a judge out there in Rhode Island who really listens to the case and sees the complexity, like somebody who didn't pay the parking meter and
Right.
listens to the whole story of why they were late for the parking meter and how tied up their lives are in these various ways. And he just sort of forgives them. But that's individual. I mean, we can't really do it that way individually. I mean, it's completely really impossible. How could we? I mean, we can't even take care of mental health issues, which require lots of creative and individual solutions.
I mean, we could.
We could,
Like
if we put money into it.
We could put money into lots of things. We
Yeah,
could,
yeah,
oh, yes,
absolutely,
like,
we could.
let's pay for more. Let's hire more judges.
Yeah, I
so
mean, if
they
that
can
was a
spend more
priority.
Ooh,
time.
I can tie this into
Priority.
basic income. Just kidding.
Yeah.
If we had a basic income and people didn't have as many useless jobs taking up their time, according to Alex's theory of the economy, there'd be more human efforts freed up, human
Yes,
time.
right.
Yeah.
Work
For
on
this
these
kind of
things.
thing,
I
yeah.
think that's right.
Yeah.
And Pablo was saying before we started the discussion, he was talking about AI and kind of all the
Yeah.
jobs that will be eliminated.
Right.
And something that's scary to me isn't that all the jobs will be eliminated. It's that we'll keep coming up. I've talked about this with everyone else before, but it's that we'll keep coming up with making up new jobs for people to do that actually don't really add anything to the economy.
Right.
And I think that's kind of how we've typically responded to technological advancement in the past, where it's part of what we've done. So, you know, like we can frame basic income as saying all these jobs are going to be eliminated, so we should give everyone a basic income. Or we could say, hey, we give everyone a basic income, and that allows us to eliminate all these jobs because we no longer have to make up these stupid jobs for people to do anymore.
Right. But I guess just to slightly
yeah.
add to my point, like it seems like this is the kind of thing that takes a lot of like creativity and, for lack of a better word, like a bit of the human touch, like in your example. So certainly people's efforts would be valuable.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's right, and I also think relating it to basic income is that money is very flexible. If you give people money, it doesn't have to be, you know, a specific gift cards or money and, you know, paying someone not to do something or something like that. But if you give people money, they can figure out what they need and they can decide what they want to buy with that money. And a lot of times, maybe you don't have an answer like directly from the government about how to handle cases. But if everybody has access to money and they can use that money to buy the resources they need for various things, then I'd be interested to see how everything shakes out. Like in a world with a basic income, if you left the prison system the way it is, you know, broken or whatever, and you added a basic income, you know, how much would that on its own make things better?
Yeah.
You know, reduce the number of criminals, that kind of thing.
Well, the Labour Party's shadow chancellor wanted to introduce a 4-day weekend by 2025, which will free up a lot of time for people to live out their lives without having to do pointless work, and they're showing that if they work less, they actually perform better.
Yeah, that's a tricky one, because I mean it's different for different jobs, and I would imagine that, you know, if you just let the market decide, you'd end up having, you know, people in certain jobs who are working, you know, 80 hours, 100 hours a week, just because that's what's efficient for that type of work, and then you'd have other people who just aren't working at all.
And maybe some people who rest and work like a few days a week.
And some people who rest and work a few days, like everything in between too,
Right.
depending on what the type of job is.
Yeah.
And, you know, I think if you try to force everyone into a 4-day work week, I don't think you can really do it because, you know, people work on weekends sometimes anyway. And B, you would be reducing kind of the effectiveness of labor allocation.
Yeah.
But then those people who work more than 4 days would get overtime, so they get more money.
Yeah, I mean, like people, you know, you could say that, or you could just say, well, people aren't going to work the job if they're not getting paid enough, and then it's up to the employer to incentivize the work by making the salary high enough. And I think that's a simpler answer. If you don't care about wages for people's survival, like if you don't care about you know, and if people aren't depending on their jobs in order to survive, then, you know, the only purpose of the wage would be to incentivize the work. So there'd be no such thing as a wage that's too low. And, you know, if the wage is too low, then people aren't going to do the job, and the employer will raise the wage, right? Like that's an efficient market. I don't know about shortening or extending the weekend to 4 days and providing overtime on the weekends. You know, I think that's just unnecessary complexities that you kind of add into the mix. Yeah, absolutely.
Two things. Number one is towards you specifically, because you mentioned the utopian society, right? In general, I want to ask you, in general, like about basic income. How would you achieve that basic income? Would that require you to increase the taxes? People would be forced to pay more taxes, or how would you redistribute the wealth? But I'm asking you specifically.
Yeah, so it wouldn't be, I don't think of basic income as a wealth redistribution mechanism. I think of it as the economy has a certain amount of resources, and it's not going to produce what people don't have the money to buy. So you need a mechanism to get money into the hands of consumers. So by default, we can think, okay, we can distribute money to the people, and then the question is, do we want part of that mechanism to be that we're making up jobs for people and making the labor market inefficient? I don't think so. I would say that, government spending is not ultimately, in terms of the economics, it's not ultimately constrained by tax revenues, it's constrained by the resources of the economy. So as long as the economy has the resources to productively respond to the spending, then the government can spend money without causing inflation.
Makes sense.
Number two, what Pablo said about basically the technology development, because over time, a lot of jobs which are taken by humans will be overtaken by machines, by robots. Such as, for example, McDonald's. Let's say if you work at McDonald's and you are minimum wage, you in the future, in the near future, you could be replaced by a robot who would do the same job, right?
Sure.
So a really good friend of mine actually had an important school presentation about this, where he said it is a really bad thing, and we should stop using robots for all these jobs and instead focus on the humans. But I disagree with that, and I think that it definitely has a lot of pros if we use robots for these jobs, and we should try to find other jobs for the people themselves.
Well, I don't
as a
know
replacement.
I don't know that we should find other jobs. I do think that we should focus on the humans, but I think it makes more sense to think of people as consumers rather than as workers.
Yes.
It's more about what can the economy produce for the people than it is, what can you get people to put into the economy. The labor market is a market, so if consumers are spending in such a way that it's causing labor to be activated, that's fine. But if you disconnect the job, at least the job in terms of needing an income to survive, needing to earn a living from people's incomes, then you can really focus on the consumer and how to benefit the consumer. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does. But we should also focus on improving our technology, of course. And
Yeah.
if I was an owner of McDonald's, I would try to use some technology in my business, of course.
Absolutely. The more jobs you eliminate, the more human potential you free up. The more freedom you give people in general.
Yes. Yeah.
And I think that's a fantastic thing, and we should absolutely be doing that. Now there's the question of we've had discussions about this in this group before. There's the question of well, how do people have meaning and purpose in their lives if they don't have a job or whatever? And that's a reasonable question to ask. So then the question is, well, how do we provide these types of meaningful experiences for people, and how do we do that efficiently? Is it to make up a job that they don't even like to force them to earn money? Maybe for some people, but not for everyone. It could maybe more people play sports or video games or something, or their academics. All kinds of stuff. Yeah, Pablo.
Yes, I have a question for you. So, assume, economics in India is different. So, when I came here, my professor was teaching about the American, how first thing I noticed the GDP, American GDP is comes from about, I guess, more than 60% is consumer spending.
Okay.
I guess 2/3 of the GDP is from the consumer spending in the United States.
What's the question?
So, would a basic income increase the GDP significantly, or should we try a different method of measuring GDP with the additional basic income?
The Roosevelt Institute said over a decade it would increase the GDP if you don't tax it away by $2 trillion.
Yeah, and it's hard to say what the productive capacity of the economy is, but if you calibrate your basic income such that once it reaches a certain level where if you pushed it any higher it would start causing inflation, or it would force the Fed to raise interest rates beyond a level that you would want them to raise them or something like that, then you can say, okay, that's our basic income, and now our economy is at whatever productive capacity it is. Yeah. I don't know, in terms of the numbers of GDP, that's hard. I have some issues with using GDP as a measure of the economy because I tend to focus on the consumer and what's produced for the consumer instead of what's produced by the country. So, for example, if I'm thinking about economic output, I would not subtract imports and add exports to it. I would say that imports are stuff that's going toward us.
Yeah.
And that's what matters. What matters is what people are getting. So if China wants to keep, selling us a bunch of cheap stuff and they just keep taking our money, we can keep printing money and getting all this stuff from China, and that's fantastic. Now, I think that's a mistake that China's making, and they'll probably stop making that mistake once we start, doing that. But as long as they want to keep sending us cheap steel, that's great. We don't have to make our own steel, right?
Yeah, true.
So the thinking in terms of GDP and what your actual domestic economy is producing, I'm not a fan of that frame either.
If you were to measure the economic output through the expenditure,
Yeah.
so public expenditure is also
So I think there is room in the economy for more consumer spending, and part of the reason is that people's incomes are skewed in such a way that it's steepening the aggregate demand curve. So it's making it more profitable for producers to keep their prices high instead of increasing quantities. Because if they increase quantities, then they'll have to lower the price in a way that decreases their profits. So if the basic income helps flatten out the demand curve, that can create an incentive for producers to produce more at current prices. So I think just by that effect, we kind of know that the economy is not at its full productive potential. But there's also the element of most of the spending in the economy is funded by the private financial sector. It's funded by borrowing in Wall Street financial institutions and all different forms of borrowing, corporate borrowing and consumer borrowing and all of that. If you fund consumer spending through more through basic income or more through money that they don't have to pay back, then that can help rein in the private financial sector a little bit and prevent some of these credit bubbles from occurring.
Yeah.
So there's kind of like all of these things happening at once that basic income just fixes. Yeah. So that was a little. It's not really about prisons, but but I think.
Well, actually, it is because
okay.
during economic downturns, people are more likely to turn to crime because they can't find a job.
Okay. Yeah. I think that's a good point, and I would be really interested to see what types of criminals we have left. Like, we'll probably still have the Ted Bundys of the world if we had a
We're
basic
talking about Ted
income.
Bundy now?
Yeah. Well.
My specialty.
Yeah.
Yeah. People like that who are doing it not because of their situation, but because of
Thrill killers.
We don't know.
some
but
kind of
not mental health
illness.
issues, really. Either.
It's a mental health issue.
Well, it
if you're a
is,
serial
but
killer.
if that's a mental health issue, all murderers have mental health issues.
Not if you can trace it to like specific circumstances. Like
I
you
would
needed,
make a distinction loosely between like organized crime kinds of
right,
where
true.
I think a lot of the murders
More
come out of
business-like
that.
murders,
More
Right.
like or like the kind of revenge killings that we're
Yeah.
talking about, and
Yeah,
somebody
yeah.
who
You're right.
seeks it out for entertainment's not quite the right word,
Right.
Right.
No, you're right.
Yeah.
Yeah. And crimes of passion are different too.
but right, or like domestic violence.
Yes.
Somebody brought up. Right.
people like Ted Bundy, which tend to be more psychopathic. They just do it because of lack of empathy. So
Yes.
I mean, they have no guilt.
Right.
They have no guilt mechanism. They're gonna commit as much crime as
That's
they can.
more of a mental health issue.
It is, but you can't really cure it. I
You
mean,
can't
it's
cure
something
it.
missing. It's not
Yeah,
something
you can't
that's
cure
messed
it,
up.
but instead of putting people like that in prison, you would put them in mental health facility, right?
It's also, I think it's not helpful to focus. It's so rare.
It's really
It's
rare.
really not
Yeah.
helpful.
What's rare?
It's really rare for like serial killers. Are really
Oh,
rare.
they were really
Yeah.
big in the 70s,
like they were popular.
They
or?
were.
There were still not many.
There were like 5.
Now it's changed to mass shootings, but in the 70s, it was
Also
all about
very
the
rare.
serial killers. Yeah.
Right.
But yeah, I mean, like I think Nick is right that all these, like they're big in the media in terms of
Right.
like we hear about them and
Yeah,
see
they
them,
are
but they're very rare in terms of like people's lived
Population.
experience.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
But would they be rare under a basic income of the criminals
What?
that remain? if you
Oh,
had
of the
basic
criminals
income?
that remain.
Yeah.
Well, that's why I keep thinking about it.
A
It's
whole bunch
not.
of people who be Ted Bundy if the only they can afford a bunch of duct
No, I think
No,
he
no, no.
means all the
I
other
mean-
criminals. Why I think about it is like in my mind, I'm already thinking like some of the lower hanging fruits is like all of the majority of crime now, which is either due to a law that I don't agree with, or like due to poverty, or like all these other things. And so like for me, the challenge in thinking about things I really dislike, like the idea of putting someone in prison, is like what do I do with these very rare
Right.
cases? What do I think is appropriate there? So I guess that's why it's interesting to me, even though it's a very small
How
actual
small is it?
percentage.
I mean,
Well, yeah.
not
I mean,
just serial killers, but people who just kill, like in a robbery situation, just people. I mean,
I
that
guess I would
happens
class that
too.
differently, though.
You what?
I would
mean,
think of that
are
differently.
they committing
yeah.
a robbery because they want an excuse to kill people and they're just doing it for fun as part of the robbery? Or I think that's pretty rare.
Do you?
Yeah.
I mean,
Yeah,
yeah,
I
if it's a
don't know.
robbery, it would probably be about money, right?
It would,
Most
but
of
it
right.
could be turned into
Most of the
worse.
time, if someone is killed in a robbery, the person doing the killing feels terrible about it and didn't ever want to kill anyone, and they really were trying to.
No, no,
That's
read the
robbery.
same story every
Well, it's not about reading stories. You can find stories about any.
I
any
mean
weird
news
thing.
reports. You're not
Well,
reading the same.
well, if I'm the news, what kind of stories am I gonna put in my news report? The ones that are most interesting, right?
Yeah, but
So,
well, to be fair, at least most of these instances are about money. If you
Yeah.
commit a robbery, even
Yes.
if you kill someone,
Yes.
it wasn't the intent to kill someone.
The original intent was
It
Right.
was to
Yeah.
Yeah. But I guess I take your point, Nick, which is like there's a lot that's maybe like worth focusing on the majority of situations before we worry about that, I guess.
Yeah, like let's talk about those once we've reduced
right.
the prison
Right.
population to
Right, like
like
10 people.
0.1%
Yeah,
of what
right,
it is now.
exactly,
now.
exactly.
So maybe this
Yeah.
whole conversation that we've had tonight is moot until we have a basic income. And we've addressed
Well,
all
I
the-
don't think most of it. Like, I think some of the problems still remain. Like,
Yeah.
do we have prisons that are like lobbying for more people? A lot of the laws that I disagree with, the basic income doesn't
Yeah.
take care of those.
That's
like, are
true.
you putting in jail for doing drugs and selling
Right,
drugs and
right.
things like that?
Yeah.
You know, are you putting people in prison for? I guess stealing would be reduced, but of the stealing that's happening, like, are you putting people in prison more quickly than I would want
Yeah.
you to? Like,
Yeah.
a lot of those kinds
It's
of things.
similar to the question of illegal immigration.
Yeah.
Like if you say, well, as long as you're a reasonable person, you can come live here.
Yeah.
Right.
Then anyone who's sneaking across the border probably has like weapons or something, right?
Right.
Well,
So, what?
yeah, I've heard that argument from you before.
Well,
but
it's true. No one would sneak across the border if they could just come in.
well,
Unless,
with plenty of people coming in who
Well,
have drugs,
Or
sorry,
human
sorry
trafficking.
to.
it's human trafficking also.
well,
yeah.
when I said like weapons, I meant include that other stuff.
Oh,
Human
well,
trafficking, drugs. and
yeah,
that,
they come through the port of entry.
No, to be fair, a lot of people who cross the border illegally, who are illegal immigrants, just do it because it's easier. To be
Right.
fair, and that's just the fact. They just do it because it's easier, because it takes a lot of time, even for me, for him, for whoever,
Get
as
processed.
immigrants, to just go to the embassy, pay the
Yeah.
visa
Yeah,
fee,
yeah.
get a visa, all that stuff.
so that's-
So they just.
That's exactly what I'm saying. If you make it easier to go legally, then the ones who are still going illegally are more interesting. They're
I
they're
think
people
it's
we
actually
actually have
easy.
to stop.
Sorry for interrupting, but I
Yeah.
think it's pretty easy, even right now. It is pretty easy to get a visa, but you would just have to waste 1 week of your life waiting in line, bringing all the
Very
documents,
clever.
paying the fee. But I don't think it is that hard
So,
to.
have you
I
looked-
like minimum
have-
bank balances.
What?
You like want to look at your bank balances and know that you have enough
Yeah,
money.
it's not a simple if you're
if
poor.
if you want to obtain a student visa, I have both a student visa and a non-student visa.
But poor people who want to come get a job.
Yeah, I'll tell you about it. If you want to obtain a student visa specifically, you have to show a bank balance proving that you have at least the amount of money that you need for college. So just for college, depending on your college, if your college's tuition fee is only $20,000, then you need to show that you have at least $20,000. As far as a tourist visa, they check whether you have enough money for however many days you're spending in the country. For example, when I came here on a tourist visa back in like 2013 with my parents had to prove that they have like $200 per day to spend. We were like here for 20 days, so $200 per day. That's what they checked actually. So of course you will need some amount of money if you want to come here. You can't just come here if you're, let's say, homeless or something. So
Well, but if
You
you're
just wanna, like,
seeking
pick
sanctuary, for
tomatoes.
example, people come with the caravan, were rushing the
Well-
border, trying to get through illegally because they were being stopped.
I would
Oh,
say,
but they were seeking
sorry, just one more thing. I would say it's not America's.
illegal to come and ask for asylum.
Yeah, if
Yes,
if
it's
you're a
supposedly
refugee,
legal.
you're supposed to present yourself at the port of entry.
Yes,
That's
you
how
are.
you do it.
Yes, you are.
But is it America's obligation to take care of all the other people
Well,
who
that's
are fleeing?
that's another.
So,
I don't
that's
think
a
it
whole
is.
other
so,
question.
so that's a question, right?
Yeah.
It's
And
like
then
it is a treaty obligation to
Yeah.
accept people who
Everyone
who want to consider petitions for asylum.
Yes, but everyone, even if they might hurt the economy or they might hurt the society in the US or whatever.
think
They help
America's
the
I think it's not everyone. I think
So-
it should be a case to case.
So I mean, like these are all great questions, and so there's a question of, is it an obligation to take care of everyone who wants to come to your country, and then there's the question of, should it be an obligation? Like, would we be better off if we did that? Would our country be better off?
Yeah.
So I mean, these are all great questions. I don't think we're going to answer them tonight.
No.
Yeah.
But we're getting toward the end, and I want to get people's final thoughts on prison and basic income Yeah, on the discussion tonight. So we'll start with Bethany.
I think that for a lot of the reasons we've brought up, like even just a basic income without other reforms would have some positive effect on recidivism, on the number of people ending up in prison. I think if I got to like sort of design my perfect system, the number of people I was really concerned about like taking away all of their freedom would probably get to be so small that it would be a really different situation where maybe you'd have more options available, like what they do in Norway or something else. But
Yeah.
yeah.
So I think, first of all, these prisoners need to be divided into two categories. Like one would be the ones which committed crimes based on poverty. So now this is one segment which you can allocate these basic incomes to. Now the question of the remaining ones which committed the crimes, let's say because of hate, some personal factors, maybe some just random killings or etc. etc. Now these I'm not sure exactly would they deserve basic income or should they? But I'm open to the ones which committed the crimes zero poverty, which would constitute a majority of the prisoners.
First, I want to say I heard a lot of good points and I learned a lot of new stuff tonight, so I appreciate that. As far as the basic income goes, I think, as you mentioned, as most of you mentioned previously, if we got basic income, crimes would decrease, and that's a really key pro for having basic income. So it's a good positive thing. As far as prisons go, I would still say that prisons should exist because I heard some people made points saying that there's no reason for prisons to even exist in the first place. But I think they do have a place for certain criminals, and that's all.
Yeah, that's a good stimulating discussion, and it makes me wonder whether that can be turned into more of a, this is sort of going into the politics of achieving a basic, building support for basic income, but makes me wonder how could this line of argument be strengthened? Like, how could we gather evidence that basic income would really reduce?
Being criminal is not inherited from, it doesn't come from the genes or something. It's about raising children in a bad conditions. So basic income would have increased the condition of people's situation. So it will be reducing the
I still want to abolish the prison-industrial complex. I really like your sort of think about the Richmond example and sort of thinking about other ways to sort of be like, okay, like what do we actually do to address this problem? I mean, I take Joe's point about like, well, given the current system, it's really hard to do that because we're usually comfortable with the time. But yeah, it feels like a really compelling argument for basic income to be like, okay, yeah, like all this poverty stuff, and Paul was talking about, like, okay, people who commit crimes due to poverty versus those who didn't, but I think, as we've talked about, so many of those crimes are connected. Of like, well, okay, like, were you involved in like drug running, with this gang because that's the only way that you could like get neat money? Were you in this bad situation because like so many times the answer is because of poverty. And then, so yeah.
Well, I was just thinking about how Norway has really generous social programs because of their sovereign wealth fund, which I believe is $2 trillion now. And that might be the reason why they only have 4,000 prisoners in the entire country of 5 million. And so that could be analogous to having a basic income, the generous social programs.
Cool.
Yeah, so it proves it in a way. I agree with everybody, but I don't know if it's just environmental. I mean, your point about, I'm sorry, I forget your name, yeah, if basic income, if it is an environmental issue, crime, brought about by upbringing and conditions in life, then a basic income would work. But I'm not convinced that that's the case. I mean, I actually do think there are genetic. What?
Most of the time.
Most of it. Okay, I guess I'm with that percentage that, you know, we don't know about and that deserve to be in prison, that have to be in prison.
Yeah. So we're gonna wrap up. Mitchell on the live stream says that he thinks under a basic income, it would make most people plan out resources when they get out, so they could have a plan for how to get back into society. At least I think that's what he's saying.
Yeah,
Good idea.
Yeah, I thought this was a great discussion.
Yeah.
I think prisons serve a very important role, or they're attempting to serve a few very important roles in our society. And you know, we kind of broke down, you know, kind of what some of the different ones were, like preventing crime and, you know, rehabilitating criminals and protecting society. I think are the three big ones.
Yeah.
Protecting the society from danger. And I think if we had a basic income in place, you know, it would help us kind of, in addition to maybe reevaluating what should actually be a crime in our society. But all of these things would help us kind of focus in on kind of the remaining problems, and maybe what it looks, how we deal with these problems doesn't look like what prison looks like today, and we might not even call it prison, and we might have different answers to these different problems instead of lumping them all into one thing.
Right.
Richard, go ahead. Final word.
Actually, there's an argument with biology that we've been domesticating ourselves by killing off the violent people over the millennia, and so
Yeah.
that's why many people have juvenile traits, like with how our domestic animals, like with domesticated foxes, they have all these vibrant colors, while domesticated foxes only have
Red and brown, whatever. Yeah.
but they're not as
Okay.
desirable. And so we've been domesticating ourselves. So maybe we could do something with
Genetic engineering.
something like that.
All right.
It's actually
That's the answer.
Open up the can of worms right there at the end.
Just to